Okay, I think looks like folks who wanted to try to arrive on time have arrived. So we're going to get started with the tutorial. My name is Juan Pablo Hourcade. I'm a professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Iowa. In this tutorial is about becoming a better academic writer. And these are just my opinion, points of view. I have been, I guess, involved in academic conferences and publishing for a little too long to admit, more than 20 years now. So I'm trying to bring those perspectives in. I was also papers co-chair for the CHI conference twice, and also have various roles in other smaller conferences too. So I bring those perspectives as well. So let's get started. I will try to stop at some points for questions, but if you have questions along the way, please feel free to ask through the chat. And we have some other hosts here who, if they see something, a good question, and it's a good time to ask it in the chat, then you can let me know, Soraya or Sane, and I will answer the question. And I'm happy to answer questions in Spanish too, and I can try in Portuguese too. But I will not be as good as Alfredo at answering in Portuguese, but I can probably understand the question. Okay, so first, a little bit of the points that I'm going to cover today. And a lot of it is about writing, but we're going to start with a very related topic. I guess one of the main inputs for writing is the research that we do. So I'll talk a little bit about how to find good research ideas. And then we're going to go through what to do after you're done with research, understanding the components of a paper, understanding how papers and articles are reviewed. And then I'm going to give you a lot of specific tips for actually doing the writing. So this is the first thing to remember, and I guess it's a lot easier to say this if you're Albert Einstein or Marie Curie, but good research eventually gets published. So one of the main precursors to having any kind of publication is to try to do good research. And then good research will eventually get published. Now, even if your research is, has some issues, but you still did a fair amount of work, and it's interesting work, then you still have good chance. You could still publish things, but they might require a little bit more work. So that's the first point. And if good research eventually gets published, one of the things that we need to think about and talk about is how to get good ideas for research. But before I go on, just to give you a sense and give you a little bit of encouragement, the very first paper I wrote when I was in my first year of graduate school at the University of Maryland. And we first published it as a tech report. And then I tried to get it published. I sent it to conferences, I think about 3 times, and it got rejected every time. And eventually we brought in the contents of that paper into a journal article about a broader topic. So it's hard to publish, and that's one thing to keep in mind as I say this. It's if you haven't had good experiences trying to get published, you're in good company and it's something common. But like I said, good research eventually gets published, or even it gets recognized. So that tech report that I couldn't get accepted into venues 20 years ago now has more than 100 citations because people actually use the research presented there. So there's hope for work that you've done, and we're going to go over ways of getting you over the line. So because I mentioned that one of the main inputs is for publishing, for being able to publish, is to conduct research that's well appreciated. One of the first questions is how to find good research ideas. And I'm not gonna, this could have been a whole other tutorial on this, but I think it's relevant to go over it. Some basic things. To me, the basic the basic requirement here is to do a lot of reading in your field and your area of interest. So becoming very familiar with the literature is very important. And then once you do that, you might find a particular area where you feel that you can contribute, that you have you're prepared to contribute, you have the opportunity to contribute. And then you can go into that space. But you have to go in with a very good understanding of the state of the art in research in that area. And then once you have that, the key thing is to, or the key idea is to find a narrow research space where you can make a contribution. So sometimes, especially if you get started within a new area, you might have a broader space that you're thinking about, but it's very difficult to make very broad contributions, especially when you're just getting started. So when I was a PhD student at the University of Maryland, one thing that Ben Schneiderman used to tell us was that you had to try to find a way of being the world's expert on something. And if you're to become the world's expert on something, you have to really pick a very narrow topic so you can be very specialized in it and be recognized as an expert in that. So that's really important, the focus of the research. And then once you have the familiarity and you have picked an area where you want to make a contribution, you have to become very, very familiar and deeply understand the methods used by researchers who are making similar contributions to the one that you want to make. So basically, you want to look at publications in similar venues to those, actually some of the best venues out there. So you can see what the best research is, what methods are being used by people who publish in those venues. And you also want to go with recent publications, because there may be sometimes the standards for what's expected change over the years. And you want to be aware of what are some of the most recent approaches used and what's expected of publications at the best venues in recent years. I wanted to go over some common problems that happen sometimes when you that might lead to research that doesn't work out and that doesn't turn into a publication. A very common one, especially if you're just getting started on something, is to tackle too broad a problem. So if you're trying to, instead of being very focused and specialized, you try to be very broad and you try to come up with a framework to solve a very large problem, but you haven't done work on smaller aspects. That's typically a challenge if you try to do that. The other thing that you have to realize is one of the key aspects of that gets judged when reviewers look at your paper or article that you're submitting is whether the problem you are addressing is important or not, right? So you have to make a good case for the importance of a problem, and you have to make sure that that it's something that you can make an argument that this is an important problem, and an argument that other people are likely to agree with. The other two are related to not doing what I just said you should try to do in the prior slide. So if you start working on a problem without being aware of what others have done before, you might be reinventing the wheel or doing some research that's very similar to what others have done before, and that could compromise your contribution. I think especially in human-computer interaction, there's quite a bit of a bias towards novelty. So you want to be careful with, make sure you're aware of all the latest and greatest research in the space where you're doing your research. And then also becoming very familiar and using appropriate methods, right? So if you approach a problem, but you're not using the methods that are acceptable in the research community for that kind of problem, then that could be something that might lead to a paper or article not getting accepted. At the same time, and I'm going to be overly generic here, I think Alfredo did a better job earlier today in the keynote, if you were able to see it. I think there's opportunities for Latin American researchers that are not present for researchers in other locations. So a lot of it comes out of the unique context of Latin America, and that's something that can be valuable. For example, there could be opportunities to collaborate with researchers in other regions of the world to try out approaches that they have tried in their own countries and try them in Latin America to see if they generalize or they need to be adapted in some way. I think those are very interesting contributions that can be important. I think you can make a good argument for that, and that can't really be done anywhere else. Only research in Latin America can validate or generalize other research that was conducted in other places. Same thing with understanding the impact of technologies in Latin America. Again, that's a way of something that only can happen in Latin America and conducted by Latin American researchers. And also the development of methods, approaches, technologies that are a good match for local realities. I think there's, again, opportunities there that are unique to Latin America that will not happen everywhere else. And of course, in addition to that, there's all the other more generic human-computer interaction research that is also available and could happen in Latin American context too. So that's a little bit of some thoughts on getting to do research that makes it easier to publish it later on. If you have any questions at this point, I ask that you type them in the chat, and I can try to answer any questions. So I'm going to give people about a minute to think of any questions, and you can type them in, and then we'll move on to the next bit of the tutorial. Okay, and this week, I'm not sure if there's anyone who's living in the US in the tutorial, but we have Thanksgiving this week in the US on Thursday. So a lot of people here are making turkeys. So that's what this is a picture of. So it's a little bit of a joke given the Thanksgiving holiday coming up. But the idea here is that that turkey is done, and maybe you're done with your research. What do you do next? And this is just a couple of quick slides on what to do before we get into the nitty-gritty of what are the sections of a paper. So it's time to read again, I guess, once you're done with the research. And the key idea here is you want to find ideally a lot of articles and papers that are somewhat close, especially in methods and in research objectives, to the research that you conduct. And again, favoring the best venues, so the best conferences, the best journals, and favoring recent publications. When you read these papers and articles, the key thing to do is to really study them not from understanding the research perspective, but to understand how the authors decided to organize them. right? So what sections do they have? Um, how does the paper or article flow? What is the purpose of each section? And then within that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this a little later, some things that you want to look at from, this is perhaps from more of a rhetorical perspective. Try to get a sense for how the authors convey the importance of a topic. That's the first thing that they need to convince you of, that this is something that's important, that's worth doing. That they convince you that they are very much familiar and aware of all relevant related work. How do they convince you that their approach is the right one, that their methods are the right ones to use? How do they present results? How do they discuss the results, right? So sometimes when you read with this, with a goal of learning how to write, you go beyond just focusing on understanding the research, but really trying to almost reverse engineer how the authors crafted together the paper from the research that they conduct. And this is something that that you can emulate as you go along. So I guess I already mentioned this, but one key thing is if you find at least one, but hopefully more than one paper or article on a similar topic at a quality venue that's recent, one possibility you can have is to mirror the article structure, especially if you're just getting started. I think that can be very helpful, and then you can emulate the style and even how they try to cover the purpose of each section in the paper or article. Okay. So just a reminder, as I go along, if you have any questions or any comments, you can type them in the chat, and I will reply back. And okay, so there's a very hard question from Temo. So he's asking that one of the more damaging issues when researching from the global south is access to article repositories, which are usually very expensive. How do we circumvent this? Yeah, so that's a hard question, and maybe I may not be the best one to answer because I'm fortunate enough to be at a university where I can access a lot of articles. So I can tell you a few things that you can try. So I guess let's start with legal things that you can do. So one possibility is to, and this should mostly work, that if you find an article, and you should be able to read the abstracts, even if you can access the article, if you think it's interesting and relevant, what I would encourage you to do is to contact the authors and ask if they could send you a copy or give you access to a copy of the paper. Oftentimes, people will post free versions on their websites. That's one place to check. You don't even need to ask in that case. But in general, if there's interested readers and they can say, you know, my university does not give me access to this, I imagine most authors will provide the articles. And I know people who do this, and it works out. So that's one tip. Another one is, I guess what we would, a phrase would be phone a friend. So if you know someone who has access to the papers in another institution, get help from them. And I know many of you already do this. That's another way. Let's see, one thing that I think will improve the situation is that I believe I know in the USA it's true, and likely also in some European countries, where if you get funding from certain agencies, there's new requirements that any papers or articles that come out of that funding have to be made freely available. So I think over time, the situation will get better, and there should be more of the research available out there. So I think that's that should be a change for the better over time. So I'll leave it there. I know sometimes people have other ways of getting things that may not be super legal, but I guess I won't say that here, but I know that it happens too. But I think there's ways of getting around not getting papers, but I realize that is a big barrier sometimes. But don't be shy about approaching authors, even if they're famous, and ask them for their papers. Hopefully they can help you out, but do check their websites first to make sure they haven't already made them available. All right, so next topic is the different components of research papers. So this is relatively basic, but we're going to talk about all those different sections and what typically goes into them. And maybe this will have some of the first bits of tips. So first thing, and by the way, this is not the order in which you should write the paper. We'll talk about that later, but we're going to go into the sections in the order in which they typically appear in a research paper. First is the title. Ideally should be short and to the point, and readers should know what to expect based on the title. At the same time, it's important to be as precise as you can, so that you don't have a very generic or high-level title. I think that's important. So, for example, if you do research in your city in Latin America, maybe you can say, blah blah blah, and maybe there's some of the researches. Some of the reason the research matters is because it was conducted there. Maybe you're generalizing something. You could mention perhaps the location, but don't say in Latin America when you did something in one city in Latin America. So try to be precise, short, to the point. I think that's very helpful. The abstract. So this is one of the very most important parts of the paper, perhaps the most important, because it's the one part of the paper that most people will read, mainly because it's the easiest one to get to. So as Temo was mentioning earlier, it's complicated to get to papers. So even I'm at a university that has a lot of access to most of the databases with research articles, but even then, to open a research article, sometimes it's several clicks, and it's not a convenient process necessarily. And so sometimes what a lot of people end up reading is the abstract, and they will make a decision on whether they read the rest of the paper based on the abstract. So this is where you really need to spend a fair amount of time thinking about doing a good job with your abstract, because when you write a paper, the goal is not just to get it published, but hopefully you want it to be read as much as possible and cited. And that's where the abstract is going to be very helpful. So it has to be it's a very short amount of text, about 120 words. And ideally should summarize the paper. And sometimes it may be 1 or 2 sentences each for explaining the problem that you're trying to solve and its significance, saying what method you use or what approach you use in your research, and then giving a brief overview of the results and perhaps a conclusion. So that's what you should go in the abstract. Okay. Now we get into the body of the paper or article, and typically you begin with an introduction. And the first thing that you have to do here is convince your readers that you're working or conducting research on a problem that's important, right? So if you conduct research on something that, and you cannot convince people that it's an important problem, then they might be done right there with your paper and it may not get accepted, right? So one, I guess my advisor when I was doing my PhD used to tell me that you have to convince people that the problem you're working on is one of the most important in the world. So it has to be a very, very strong case for the importance of the research. It is more and more common these days to include in the introduction a clear statement as to the contribution that the paper or article makes to the field, to human-computer interaction in our case. So that's in a way to make it easier for people reviewing your paper or article to review it, because one of the questions they're likely to be asked when they're reviewing is, what is the contribution that this paper or article makes to human-computer interaction? So if you do that for them, if instead of them having to think about your paper and writing the contribution, you have it right there in the introduction for them, that makes their life easier, makes your paper or article more likely to get in. Oftentimes, but not always, the introduction gives a quick overview of how things turned out. So you have you present the problem, then you give a little overview of your contribution, which might include a little bit about your method and the things that you did and how those contributed to HCI. And oftentimes, like I said, you give people a sense of how it turned out, what were the main results or outcomes of the research. That is something that I see more and more recently. Maybe 20 years ago, it was not so common. And some people still don't tell you how things turn out. You have to go all the way to the end of the paper to find out what their results are. But it's often something that you see in the introduction now. It's a quick overview of the rest of the paper and what you're going to find there. Typically, immediately following the introduction, you have, or sometimes as part of the introduction, you have a literature review. Some people put it in a different part of the articles. I think I've only seen people from one institution in particular in the Northeast of the United States do that, where they stick it at the end of the paper. But I think generally you want it up front. And the idea here is not to show that you've read all the things you were supposed to read, but you have to show an understanding of related work and present an overview of it. That's kind of a critical overview. And in that overview that you provide, you have to establish a gap in research that your work is filling. Okay, so you have to show a good understanding of related research. That's a critical understanding that gives people credit for the things that are already known, but at the same time establishes a gap in the research that you're filling. Okay, some things that reviewers will look for is they're going to look at, one, is it comprehensive? Are you missing any obvious research that should be listed there that's very relevant to what you're doing? And two, people will look at bias too. So for example, if you're only citing people who are from your institution or who shared your PhD advisor, then that might not look so good, right? So having comprehensive coverage is a good thing. And this is typically followed by what I will generically call a statement of research. So once you have identified a gap in the research through your review of the research literature, then you make your statement of research. Now, these can come in many different forms. So the very traditional form, if you're doing experimental research, is to have hypotheses. Another approach that's very common these days, I would say even more so, is to have research questions or some kind of research objective, right? So what question are you looking to answer? And otherwise, you can just kind of mention a research purpose. So it might depend on the kind of approach that you're using, what would make sense. But essentially, the idea here is that you make it very clear what your objective is in the research that you're presenting through the paper or article. So you establish your objective and your goal, then you move on to the method of the paper. So this is where you have to tell people what you did. So if it's an experiment, there's a standard set of items that you would present. But otherwise, I think there's many kinds of research these days. So you could just have to present in a way that's standard for the kind of research that you're doing. What methods, techniques, or processes you follow. Okay. And I think this is one of the areas where it's very good to find recent articles in good venues that have used similar research methods to yours to see how they present those methods right here. So you do it in a way that's standard and accepted nowadays. Then you present your results. This is my own bias here. I prefer to go from big picture to details, but there's more than one way of doing this. For experiments, there's some basic, somewhat obvious tips that I provide in the slide. Again, in this situation, if you can find recent articles in good venues that have used similar methods to yours, you can get a sense for what are some good ways of presenting your results for this kind of method that you use. And it could be that your results are non-experimental too. And in that case, again, following some kind of accepted or broadly accepted organization for your results is a useful thing. So again, that checking with similar articles is very important. Then you get to the discussion. This is oftentimes the most interesting part of papers or articles, whereas I think a lot of the other sections can often be almost mechanical, right? So there's a formula for presenting your methods. Sometimes there's almost like pretty much a formula for presenting your results, because it is what it is, right? You run your statistics or you do your analysis and maybe a qualitative analysis. And there's only so many ways to present that, and there's some accepted formats for presenting that. So there's not a lot of leeway as to how you might do it. In the discussion is where things get a little bit more interesting. And this is also in particular because it's where your own voice comes out. In the method section, in the results section, you want to try to be as objective as possible and try to just present what you did and how it turned out, ideally without a lot of interpretation or without any interpretation. But in the discussion is where you can have your voice come out and make your own interpretations of the results. So essentially, you want to say, what do you think are the implications of the research? How do you think the results should be interpreted? You want to here make a case as to how the results in your research have advanced the knowledge in the field. You might also provide your opinion on why you think you got the results you got. You might address practical implications of your results. So for example, what should other researchers do differently based on your results? What could practitioners do differently based on your results? And one thing that's important and actually can help you out in the discussion is to include a limitation section. And hopefully, as you do your research, you are aware of any limitations within your research, things that you couldn't do. Maybe it's you didn't have a lot of participants, or you only conducted research in one location. There may be any number of things, right? And it's better for you to include them ahead of time, these limitations, and actually argue as to why, in spite of those limitations, you still make a contribution. It's better for you to do that than for the reviewers to identify the limitations and kind of knock you down because of that. So it's my sense it's better to be upfront about limitations, argue about why it's still you're still making a contribution, and just have that get that out of the way when you write your work. Some people like to discuss future research. This is really optional, but it can be something nice to do. And so that can include what you plan to do next yourself, and maybe what you think are other issues that should be explored in the future. So now we're getting to the end of the paper. In the conclusion, there's a summary of methods, results, and discussion, typically a reiteration of the significance of research. And that might come also with another subsection on acknowledgements of contributions that you get from other people or from funding. Right, so this is more of a straightforward section to write. I would say just be careful here to not make claims or that are not supported by the research that you did. Just be careful with that. References at the end. This have been getting longer and longer with easier access to electronic databases. But reviewers are likely to see if they think you have an adequate number of references. They might look at bias to see how many references include at least one of the authors, or authors from the same institution. They might also look at your coverage in terms of years, for example, in the paper cited. For example, if it's a problem that's been around for quite some time, they might think, well, are they aware of the early literature on this topic? If it's something that where there's been a lot of change recently, they might check to see if you have some of the latest research included. Okay. So quick pause here, and just want to give people a chance to ask questions about the different components of a paper. And then we'll wait a minute for any questions. And then the next topic we're going to cover is what reviewers typically look for beyond the things that I mentioned in the previous, that I just mentioned in this previous section of the tutorial. So one of the motivations for this, what I'm going to mention in this section of the tutorial, is that this is to make you aware of the types of things that reviewers look for, but also to give you a useful tool for reading papers yourself if you want to critically analyze papers and discuss them with others. I find that these concepts that I will tell you about can be very useful and informative. Okay, so these are the ones that we're going to cover. So we'll go, I've talked about some of these already, but we'll go through them one at a time. So importance I mentioned earlier, and this is a key prerequisite for someone getting interested in your writing and in your research, is convincing people that you're working on an important problem. And that will have a direct impact on whether people think that your research contribution is significant or not, right? So if you're working on a problem that maybe you did everything right, but people don't think it's an important problem, then it's going to have a harder time getting accepted. Whereas if people feel it's an important problem, sometimes even if some things are not perfect with your research, they might be more willing to let it in. So so the importance is first thing to think about. Um, you want to convince people of the significance of your contribution, and think about what is the big idea out of this paper. What should people go back home with from your paper? What should they learn? What is the one thing or three things that you want them to remember about the research that you did? And that should come through very clearly in your writing. Okay, more concepts. Credibility, that's directly related to the methods that you use, pretty much. So you presented a problem, you identified a gap in the literature, and you set out with a research objective to do some research. And the question is, for credibility, did you use the right method to achieve your research objective, or to answer your research question, or to test the hypothesis? So that's going to go directly to your credibility. Because if you use the right methods, then your conclusions are likely to be right. If your methods are not good, then your credibility will suffer, and so will the paper. So that's a really important aspect too. So I've had this list around for quite a while of concepts to look for in papers, and one that I have added in the past 5 years is ethics. And I think this is mainly due to the ubiquity of computing in people's lives, and I guess some concerns I've had about some research in computing. And this is questions that I guess we should all ask ourselves even before we start any research. And the first question is doing this work a good idea in the first place? Could it lead to potentially harmful outcomes? And the key thing that you want to show in the paper is that maybe if it's research that could be used in multiple ways, right? Maybe for some good purposes, which I'm sure would be the way that you would do it. But if there's potential negative uses of your work, you should show some kind of awareness that you thought about it, and perhaps you have given some thought about how those negative consequences could potentially be avoided. So it's good to think about ethics before we start the research, and then show that we have thought about them when we write our papers too. All right, the next one is a bit of a feature in the human-computer interaction community, where there's always been a strong bias towards novel research and novelty. So novelty could come in a number of ways. So maybe are you addressing a new problem, for example, right? So there's novelty there. So I'm going to be chairing a session this afternoon where there's at least a couple of papers that are presenting on the COVID-19 pandemic. That's obviously a novel problem. So there's novelty there. There could be novelty in approaches or methods, right? So question there is, is it an obvious way of going about solving the problem? Is it a clever way? But the key question here, which goes back to the contribution of the paper, is whether there is new information or new knowledge to be learned from the paper or article, right? what can people learn from it, and is what they can learn from it something new? And if it's new, is it obvious that you would get that result, or is it something that's interesting, perhaps a little bit unexpected, right? People will also look at whether you're doing incremental work or not. If it's something very novel that no one has tried before, reviewers tend to be more permissive on the quality of the methods, or the like the number of participants and the rigor of the approach. If it's very novel, they're willing to give you a break on some of those things. But if it's incremental work where it's a system that's been around for a while and you're trying it in a new situation, for example, then the expected rigor will be higher. So you need to be very careful that you have very strong methods and that you have a lot of resources dedicated to research to make a contribution. Okay. So that's novelty. Here now we're going to get into some other concepts that are a little less important, but if you have them in there, they can also be an important thing to bring into your paper. So the first one is applicability. So basically, for the reviewer or for other researchers, is there anything in the paper that might affect how they run research or how they think other researchers will run research in the future, right? So have the contributions of the paper change how people might do research? Or alternatively, is this highly applicable research where maybe it could be used by practitioners in some way, where there's a very practical consequence and it's some technology that's ready to be used in the field without intervention from researchers and be useful, right? So that would be the applicability side. Other aspects, first one is kind of important actually, generalizability. So typically when we do research in HCI, it tends to be about some kind of technology. And we typically study the technology in some context. And the question here with generalizability is how broadly do the results of the research apply, or how broadly are they likely to apply, right? So the more broadly they apply and the more generalizable the research, the better it is for the paper and for the article, the greater the chance it will have an impact and be accepted. The other topic there on scalability, sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't, but it's a question to ponder always is, will the research, does it work only for situations where there's, say, only a small number of users or a small number of sites, or does it require a lot of technical setup that wouldn't be easily scalable to other places? Or is it something that uses some generic technology that could easily be replicated in many places? That's a question to think about and to make it clear. If you're doing something that's very scalable or generalizable, you want to highlight that so in your writing, so it becomes clear to your readers and your reviewers. Okay. Okay, and then the other thing that reviewers will look for is about your own assumptions as a writer, right? So when you write a paper, oftentimes you make some assumptions. Oftentimes they are about the fact that it's okay to bring technology into a new setting, or that technology might make a positive difference, or that people want something, or that something is a problem. right? Or that some technology might be broadly available in the future. So I think this is something where you want to be careful when you plan your research and when you write about it, to think about your own assumptions and make any clarifications that might be necessary to convince readers and reviewers that your assumptions are reasonable, um, and that you can still make a solid contribution uh, given the assumptions that you went in with. All right, and the last item I have in my list of things that reviewers look for, and this is one of the harder ones, is readability. Um, one thing that I've noticed over the years of being involved in conference committees and managing editorial reviews is that I don't know if it's because we're so distracted by other technologies, but reviewers are not um, reading papers and articles as carefully as they used to. And you want to make it therefore you want to make your article and your paper as easy to review as possible, which means that you have to consider people being unable to sit down and read your paper from beginning to end without interruptions. So a lot of your reviewers, a lot of your readers will be reading your paper a little bit at a time, and then they might be distracted, and then they might come back again. And you want to do your writing in a way that's easy for them to get back to where they were before, or if they want to look back at your paper and find some piece of information, you want to make it easy for them to find it. Okay. So that's something that I would say it's a newer concept, a newer situation that you have to be aware of. So what are some things that make it easier to write in a way that works for this new kinds of readers and reviewers? I would say the first thing is structuring your paper well. So again, doing all that reading ahead of time of articles that have been published in good venues recently will give you a sense of how to structure your paper well. And then that should make it easier for your readers and your reviewers to find some information about your paper. So for example, if they want to quickly find out about the characteristics of your participants, there should be a clearly labeled section on participants, and they should be able to find it easily. Or if they want to check on your design methods, right? They should be able to find that easily. So good structure is important. Good flow is important too. So ideally, this is not a paper where people have to be going back and forth through sections to understand it, but it should flow well, should be logically organized. And the idea here is you have to have good writing at a high level with your structure and a logical presentation of information. And perhaps the one that's a little harder for us in Latin America is the good writing in individual sentences or paragraphs, just because we have to write in English as a second language a lot of the time. So that's those are the key parts. The last two bullets, I don't think we have a problem most of the time in Latin America because we're very much aware of these issues. But you want to be culturally neutral, make sure you don't have any cultural references that only people from your country would understand. And I don't think you'll be using unnecessarily difficult words like some people do sometimes from some universities. So that's a little bit about readability. Okay, before we move on to the next part of the tutorial, because we've been going for about an hour right now, we're going to take 10 minutes off. So 10 minutes, we will be back at 37 past the hour. Okay, so 10 minutes off, and we'll be back in 10 and continue the tutorial then. Okay, and the next part is going to be about writing itself. And if you have any questions about anything so far, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll stick around. Okay, so.
Hola, ¿alguien de la organización está ahí en este intervalo?
Sí, aquí estamos.
¿Quién está de host?
Juan Pablo.
Capaz que soy yo, sí.
¿Puedes checar dónde habilitar los subtítulos automáticos de inglés?
Ok, me voy a fijar.
Porque se me olvidó antes, pero creo que
Oh,
puede ayudar muchas personas.
sí.
Igual para quienes tengan preguntas, pueden preguntar en español o en portugués. Aquí vamos a estar asistiendo a Juan Pablo, aunque ya estamos, creo que ya estamos en break. Aquí vamos a estar un ratito más por cualquier duda que tengan.
I have a comment, Juan Pablo.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about putting a title to your papers, and you mentioned something like they had to be like really descriptive of the subject that you're dealing with in your paper. But I've seen that there are some papers that go all the way to the opposite side, and they have really edgy titles. Yes. Like, so when will those be recommended? Like is that just a hook, or it shouldn't be done? I don't know.
So I think it's personal preference. I think the reason people do those, and I have done at least one of those, I think. But I don't know, sometimes you can be edgy and you can be descriptive too. But I think the reason people do those is sometimes if they want people to attend their talk at a conference, they will have an edgy title. So I think the key is, if you want to do that, you have to try to be descriptive too, because if you're not, then in the long term, when people are searching databases for work to cite and all that, if you don't have a title that's descriptive, then they may skip over your work and cite someone else. So I think it's, in the long term, it's to your advantage. So I'll give you an example of one that I did many years ago, where we did a review of YouTube videos of very young children using tablets and smartphones when those first came out. And so the title was something like, "Look, my baby's using an iPad." And then it said, an analysis of YouTube videos of young children using touchscreen devices. So that kind of had to try to have a combination of a descriptive thing, but also something that might get people to go at the conference. But so I think if you want to be edgy and have something funny or interesting, you have to try to be as also descriptive if you can.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Juan Pablo.
Sí.
Yo tengo una pregunta. ¿Cómo haces para preparar un buen chimarrón o un buen
el mate?
Mate.
Hay que empezar con buena yerba.
Sí, eso sí.
Y bueno, eso es lo principal. Y después no hay que tener cuidado. Yo pongo toda la hierba para un costado, entonces vas usando diferentes partes de la hierba mientras vas tomando el mate y vas corriendo la bombilla de a poquito.
Y de la primera chupada del mate, ¿cómo se hace?
Sí, ahí,
Al enemigo.
bueno, primero que nada hay que dejar, ahí está, ahí me puso el título del artículo que yo estaba mencionando. Bueno, la idea aquí es que con la primera hay que evitar que entren las hojitas de la hierba, entonces hay que dejarlo con un poco de agua antes de probar, de empezar. O sea, tienes que dejarlo un par de minutos para que se agranden las hojas, si no, problema. Y después lo otro que hago es, cuando se pone por primera vez, pongo el dedo arriba del lugar por donde se chupa, entonces no entra aire por ahí, y al bajar así, entra un poco mejor sin que entren las hojitas pequeñas.
Vale. Un tutorial dentro de otro
Sí.
tutorial. Gracias.
Sí, esto es algo que requiere un poco de costumbre, porque el mate no es una cosa que uno tome por primera vez y diga, uy, qué bueno que está, quiero más, tomar más. Sí, no.
¿Y pudiste encontrar donde se habilita el subtítulo?
Lo de closed captioning no lo veo. Mira, veo si las cosas mías, participantes, chat, la grabación, anotar, y después hay cosas puedo parar o hacer pausa en la grabación, permitir que otros puedan anotar cosas, pero no me aparece el closed captioning por ningún lado. Ups. Capaz que fue algo que hay que habilitar al crear la reunión, no sé.
O Zoom Events es different from... Oh, es diferente del Zoom normal.
Sí,
No sé.
pero capaz que es una de esas cosas que hay que habilitar antes de tiempo, porque
Ajá.
no la veo por ningún lado la opción.
Ok, gracias.
Sí, espero que no esté hablando demasiado. Uy, sigo cambiando esto sin querer. Que no esté
No,
hablando
está muy
demasiado
bien.
rápido.
No, está súper. Me gustaría tener participado de este tutorial cuando estaba en maestría.
Sí, a veces. Sí, bueno, para a mí también, porque son las cosas que uno aprende con el tiempo.
Sí. Pero gracias por compartir este conocimiento, ¿no? Porque son a veces muchas cosas que no nos damos cuenta que son muy importantes.
Oigan, ¿qué no iba a ser así como el coffee break en ¿cómo se llama? El que estaban mostrando el día de ayer, en el Spatial Chat o algo así? ¿O hay alguien ahí? ¿O nada será comunidad?
Allá es solo para quien está de castigo.
¡Y! Buena onda, ¿eh? Con razón no había nadie más que yo.
No, sí se habilitó, pero creo que más bien las personas, los participantes han estado aprovechando los breaks para hacer otras cosas, no, atender otras necesidades que tienen, realmente no,
Oh,
no
ya.
lo han utilizado.
Me sentía muy solos ahí en el Spatial.
Pueden poner una canción de Maná atrás.
Para los participantes que están
la
aquí
pongas, porque
y
entonces
no
sí me
saben de qué hablamos, les voy a poner el enlace en el chat por si quieren probar ese espacio.
Ajá. Oye, Juan Pablo, ¿y qué onda con el bias de, por ejemplo, cuando tú presentas algo de Latinoamérica y te lo revisa gente que no tiene idea de qué es lo que sucede en nuestra región? ¿Alguna recomendación?
O sea, yo diría que tiene sus positivos y sus negativos, ¿no? Porque
Ajá.
creo que cada vez hay más apreciación de que hay necesidad de que la investigación venga no solo de Estados Unidos, Canadá y Europa Occidental y parte de Asia, ¿no? O sea, que se expanda más. Creo que hay más conciencia de eso, o sea que por ese lado es un positivo de que algo venga de Latinoamérica. Eh, lo que hay que hacer sí es no, es tratar de presentar cuanta más información sea posible para dar un buen sentido del contexto y cuáles son las cosas más particulares del contexto en que se hizo la investigación. Y bueno, y la que es más difícil que, que se va a dar en algunos casos es que si hay cierta percepción de que a veces de que la investigación viene de lugares que no, quizá no son de famosos internacionalmente, a veces se fijan con un peine fino, digamos, en la investigación, más que lo harían si se piensan que viene de MIT o de Stanford o un lugar de esos. Ojo, también pasa si eres de un lugar que no es tan conocido en Estados Unidos, pero eso es algo que sí, es una... No tendría que pasar, pero puede pasar.
Claro.
Así que hay que tener cuidado, por eso eh, tratar de seguir ciertas estructuras y pautas que han sido usadas recientemente en artículos que han sido publicados en lugares prestigiosos. Eso siempre ayuda porque si sigues eso es más difícil que te puedan dar por la cabeza. Pero,
Sí, sí.
em,
Total.
sí. O sea, es un poco más difícil, diría, quizá innovar o hacer algo completamente que nadie haya hecho antes, porque quizá te vayan a cuestionar más que si vienes de un lugar famoso, digamos. Esa es la parte que no tendría que ser así, pero que puede resultar a veces.
Cierto, cierto, gracias.
Bueno, dije y 37 y son y 40, así que arrancamos de vuelta, cambio a inglés. Okay, we'll continue now getting to the part when we start writing. And first question is, where do we start? And remember earlier I walked through all the different parts of the article, and I said you shouldn't probably write them in the order in which you read them later, right? So what section to start on depends on what you have available to you. But this is one possible progression through the different parts of the paper. The one thing that might be different, perhaps, is if you have already done a fair amount of reading and maybe you had to write a proposal before you conducted the research, you might already have some related work ready to go. And a section where you had to analyze existing research and justify why the research you wanted to conduct was important. Maybe if you did that already, you might move that to be the first item. But otherwise, you might start with your research objective, right? So you know what was your goal, what was your hypothesis, or what was your research, what were the research questions you were trying to answer, and that's a good place to start because everything should flow from that, right? So then your approach, like your methods, should flow from your research objective, right? So the approach should match the objective. The methods you use should be the right methods to achieve your research objective. That's should follow logically. And then the analysis of your results should follow from your research approach, right? And your objective too. So that's a logical progression through your writing. And then once you have the analysis of the results, you might move to the discussion. And again, the discussion, we have to tie back to the research objectives supported by the approach and the results. That should make it easier to put things together in a logical way. Like I said, maybe you have already done a fair amount of reading of the literature and you had a related work section ready to go. And if not, that would say that's would be a logical next thing to write. So you can establish a research gap to set up the objective. And also show a mastery of relevant research. So make sure people know that you know all the latest relevant research and that your research objective fills a gap that had not been filled in the literature before. Then, you might write your conclusion, which should follow from the discussion, right? So it's a little bit of a summary. And to me, typically the last thing that I write is the introduction, or one of the last things. So the first thing I have in the body of the paper, I write it last, and that's where I have to establish the importance of the research and explain my contribution. And I write it last mainly because of the last part. Maybe I have a sense of the importance before I start the research. I could write that, but it's really hard to do a good job explaining the contribution if you haven't written the other parts of the paper before. So that's why I typically leave at least some of the introduction for last. And then once you have everything together, then it's a good time to write the abstract. And then sometimes the title is the last thing that I come up with. I don't know, I don't pay a lot of attention to it until the end. So that's it, but then you have a very, very good sense as to exactly what people will find in your paper, and you can write a title. Now, we're all different. This tends to work for me, but depending on the research, I might go in a different direction. Like I said, oftentimes related work is available ahead of time if you've written some kind of proposal. So you might have that already available, and that might make it easier to go through your sections in a logical way too. Okay. Next bit is what to do as you write. My experience is one of the most difficult things to do is to try to write for people who do not have your experience working on your project. And that is very difficult to do because when we write about our research, it's often research that we worked on for many months, sometimes many years. And we are very intimately knowledgeable of a lot of details in the research and a lot of assumptions that we made. And there are a lot of things that are obvious to us that may not be obvious to readers. So one of the most difficult things to do when you write a paper or article is to take a couple of steps back and be very careful to write it in a way that you present information for someone who is not familiar with your research, or sometimes even with the problem you're dealing with, or with the context in which you're conducting your research. You have to remember your audience. Typically for human-computer interaction, We have very interdisciplinary audiences. So at least most of your paper should be available to people from a variety of fields, right? So you're going to have people with computing backgrounds, people with psychology backgrounds, people with design backgrounds, people with sociology backgrounds, people with humanities backgrounds, right? So we have a very broad set of disciplines in human-computer interactions nowadays. So we have to, at least for most of the paper, so people can get a sense of the contribution and what to learn from the paper, we have to write for a general audience. Sometimes there might be sections of the paper that are more specialized. So if you write a systems paper that would go to a conference like WIST, for example, that might have some very technical sections in the paper, but at least some other parts of the paper, like the introduction and the discussion and conclusion, should be very available to a non-technical audience. We are an international field, so writing for an international audience is important. And I think this is a lot easier for people from Latin America when compared to, for example, people from the United States. So I think that shouldn't be a problem for you. And then the other thing is that's a little difficult is to try to write for long-term relevance, right? So when you write your paper, try to think, how do I write this paper in a way that someone 10 years from now, maybe 20 years from now, could still read it and learn something from it, and have it be relevant to the work that they're doing. So that's another challenge and something to think about as you're writing. Okay. Here are some things that could be, I guess we could call these mistakes to avoid. First one is don't be repetitive. So sometimes if you don't organize your paper well, there might be repetition. So you might say the same thing more than once. And that not only takes up room in your paper or article, but it can make it more difficult to read or not as pleasant to read. So try not to repeat the same thing twice. The next one, this is super important. If you make a claim, any kind of claim, unless you make it very clear that it's your opinion, for example, in the discussion section. But if you make a claim that about anything, you have to back it up with references, right? So if you say something like, if there's a menu with 10 items, it takes longer for people to select something to make a decision than if the menu has 3 items, right? It's true, but you have to find a reference to back that up, even if it's something that feels obvious, right? Put a reference there. As you write, also, you want to be clear, specific, and precise, right? So have precision in your writing, especially when you're talking about methods, because ideally, for many kinds of HCI research, you want the ideal situation to be that if someone wanted to recreate your research, to replicate it, that they're able to do it. And in order to be able to replicate your research, they need very precise explanations of what you did, and very clear explanations. So I would say in methods and in results in particular, very important to be clear, specific, and precise. All right, the next one is my personal philosophy for writing, but it's okay if you want to do some things in a different way. I think it's better, obviously you might start out with an outline and know what you need in each section of the paper. But once you're writing the content, I find that it's better and you end up with a better flow of information if you just write things out and worry later on about grammar or style. So let all your thoughts come out, and then you can fix your sentences later. That tends to lead to better flowing writing, and then it's faster to fix any mistakes later on your own. But that's what works for me. Other people might have other preferences. Okay, here's where we start getting into things that might be a little harder to do because they depend on other people in our resources. So if you can get feedback from other people, maybe their peers, maybe a more senior colleague, that can be very useful, starting with an outline and then moving from there. Getting that feedback and iterating on your work can really help you and help you avoid problems. Even if you run your ideas by someone who might be a little bit outside of the field of human-computer interaction, that's still useful because you might get that outside perspective of someone who might say, what do you mean by this? Or what does this mean? And that might help you understand some of your assumptions that maybe you didn't explain well. So the other tricky part here is and this is one challenge that I know can be tricky for writers in Latin America, is if you don't have high fluency in English, which is a language where if you want to go to some of the top venues, is what you have to publish on. And then if you can have access to a proofreader before you submit your article or paper, that can be very useful too. But I know it's not always possible. Okay, here we're getting into more, these are style considerations in this case for writing your paper. So writing style and the writing style in English. And this is a tricky part too, because sometimes what might be considered a good style in Spanish or Portuguese may not always be considered a good style in English. So it's challenging. So this is really for, I guess, expectations of writing in English. The first one is to avoid passive voice. So for example, example of passive voice would be saying something like, the participants were consented by the researchers, right? That's passive voice. And instead you want to use active voice, where you would say the researchers consented the participants. So that's one thing that just basic recommendation of writing style. Avoiding long sentences, that's another big one. And I know sometimes, I don't know, I haven't read so much in Portuguese, like literature, but I know in a lot of very enjoyable Latin American literature, sometimes we have beautiful long sentences, but those don't work so well for scientific articles in English. So you have to, if you end up with some long sentence, look for ways to break it up into shorter sentences. Also important to have smooth connections between sentences and paragraphs. And that's where you want to avoid your sentences to read like a set of facts, like something you could put in a bulleted list, but instead have nice flow between your sentences with sometimes with words that can connect one sentence to the next. And make good use of paragraphs. I have reviewed papers sometimes where there's paragraphs that are almost like 1 page long in a paper, and it just makes it really hard to read and to process information that way. So having your paragraphs, each paragraph really be about one idea or one topic, I think really helps. And if you're changing your topic, then start a new paragraph. Okay. More style tips. So being careful with punctuation is important. And so, become familiar with the Oxford comma. That's something that people like to use, and just be careful with not having too many commas or how you use semicolons. Just be careful with that. Okay, another thing that will annoy reviewers is if you use many non-standard acronyms or abbreviations, that could be a problem. So sometimes it's fine to have, 1 or 2 acronyms or abbreviations that you use in your paper where, let's say if you have something that you're referring to that's 3 words long, and you use it all over your paper just to save space and sometimes even make it easier to read, you can just use the 3 letters. That's fine if you have 1 or 2 of those. But if you're having like 5 or 6 of those and they're not standard, then that will make your paper a lot harder to read, and people will be constantly going back to check what you mean by each one of those. It's just not a good idea. Keeping your verb tense consistent is also important, especially within paragraphs. So don't switch from past to present to past within a paragraph if you can. So be careful with that. And in terms of vocabulary, using formal, precise, but understandable vocabulary is important, I think. We talked about formal and precise before, and understandable is mainly, I think you wouldn't have a problem. It might be more of an issue with if people try to be overly technical in some ways. Okay. Okay, now a very practical tip, and I hope a lot of you are doing this already. The one nice thing we have now, for many, many years, if you wanted to use a reference or citation manager, you had to pay. They cost money. Now there's options, including Zotero, which is free, and it's not run by a company that has ulterior motives. But there's also other free options from companies if you prefer those. But I very, very much, if you're not doing this already, I strongly encourage you to use a reference or citation manager. And the advantage here is you can very easily collect related work. You can easily find it if you've used something before, and it will make sure that you're citing your work correctly in your papers and articles. So it's if you're not doing it already, make sure you use it. I use Zotero myself, but there's other products out there too. Okay, back to even more tips. This is a little bit once you're getting closer to finishing your writing. So you have a draft of your paper ready. What are things to look for at this point? Once you've written everything out, you have a draft. Proofreading, very important, right? So try to identify any grammar issues, any spelling issues. There's services out there now. So there's Grammarly, for example. A lot of people use that. Even native English speakers use Grammarly too. So that can help with the detail of the paper, the proofreading. You also want to, take a couple of steps back, maybe take a day or two away from the paper, go back to it and see if it has a logical progression and structure, that if somebody picks it up for the first time and they don't know anything about your research, they can really understand it, and the progression makes sense and it gets people to where you want them to get to. And there's not a need to be jumping around to find information. And then think about whether your paper or article makes sense at a high and low level. So at a high level, I would say, look at your sections. Do they have a logical order? Do they make sense in the order in which they're presented? Does the information you have in each section make sense? Does it make sense that it is where it is? And then at a low level, you want to make sure, again, that your writing makes sense in the sentences that you write when you're getting to the details of the paper. And the last one I already mentioned, but I'll mention it again. You want to make the work of reviewers as easy as possible. And your sections that you have should make it very, very easy for reviewers to identify the key elements of your work, right? So things like what is your research objective, what methods you use, how many people participated in your research, what were the most important results, the most salient results, what are the things that people should learn from your paper. Those should be very easy to find, easy to identify. Okay, a couple of other things. This is more on the obvious side, but most papers are going to have some figures and some tables of information. You want to make sure you do a good job with those. So for example, if you find yourself that you're using a lot of numbers and putting a lot of results in a paragraph that might be hard to read, maybe that's a sign that you need a table. Make it a lot better organized and easier for your readers to go through. Figures can be very useful too. So the key thing there is to have a nice complement. You don't need to have information twice, right? So if it's already, some numbers are in a table, maybe you don't need to mention everything again in your text, but maybe highlight perhaps the one or two most important results. Or you might use a figure and point readers to the figure and to notice something in the figure, right? If you have a chart, for example. So make sure you have a good pairing between those, that they complement each other. In some cases, you may be able to find out what criteria reviewers will use to review your article. So if that's the case, then you want to make sure that whatever reviewers need to write about your article, that you make that easy to find, and if possible, provide them with the text that they need. I think that will make the work of the reviewers easier, and it make it more likely for your paper or article to be accepted. And the last one is, I don't know, it's a little bit of maybe being careful with the system, but think about who might end up reviewing your paper, who would be the obvious people who might review it based on the kind of work that you've done. Make sure you cite the articles that they wrote that are relevant to your work. And above all, I would say just be careful when criticizing others' work. I think the best way of making sure that you show there is a gap in research is to acknowledge the contribution of others, but say, they so-and-so contributed this, and that, but they, in their work, they were not able to, they never got to answer this other question, right? So you can still identify a gap in research without criticizing other people's work. All right, we're getting near the end here. This is basic recommendations, and this is in part coming from being papers chair for the CHI conference twice, and where we had something like 2,000 submissions. And so when you have that many, you see all kinds of mistakes being made. So just, you don't want to do everything right and then have your paper desk rejected because you don't follow basic requirements from the conference or journal that you're submitting to. So very common formatting requirements include anonymity. So just don't mess that up. Sometimes just know whether your work is supposed to be anonymous or not, and then be careful with that, because you don't want to be rejected because you forgot to take out your name from the paper. Some venues will have page limits, so make sure you comply with those too, or you might get desk rejected. And deadlines, most of the time they're pretty firm, right? So just make sure you submit versions early and update them. Don't wait until the last minute to submit something. And hopefully you're going to be fine, but just be careful with those little details that can cause problems. Okay. And one last one last recommendation is you're going to get reviews, and this is a part that is one of the hard, either the most rewarding parts of being in academia, or one of the most frustrating parts is getting reviews back. And the truth is, everyone gets rejected all the time. Even some of the most famous people from the best universities, they get rejected quite a bit too. So if your work doesn't get in, then just remember everybody gets rejected. We have an expression in English that's having thick skin, so just don't let it bother you too much. And try to learn from the reviews. Hopefully, if you have high quality reviews, or at least some of the reviews are good, then they should help you do a better job with your work the next time around. So I think that's something to recognize. And oftentimes, good research gets rejected, sometimes once, sometimes twice, and then you get it in, and you improve it each time, and it becomes better, and that helps you the next time around. So just recognize that oftentimes getting work published is a process, and it just involves trying again and seeing if you can do better. Sometimes it could be useful to go to more senior people to try to interpret feedback. So remember this, and not a lot of people try this, and you may not be able to get help, but it's worth at least trying. So I know, for example, a few years ago, I had someone approach me who had some work rejected 2 or 3 times and just didn't know what to do with it, but thought there was something good in it. And she asked me to look at it, and I I agree there were some good things in it, and I gave some recommendations for restructuring the paper and changing the focus of the paper, but still with the same research being presented. And the paper ended up winning a Best Paper award the next time it got submitted. So, so sometimes it's just it's important to get someone else's perspective on your work, and maybe they see value in your work in a way that you didn't think about it before, and that might help you write your work in a different way if you're having a hard time getting it accepted. Okay, so I think the key point here is do not get too discouraged, and I think even very successful authors get their work rejected on a regular basis. So don't be worried if that happens to you. Okay, so that is the end of the part where I'm talking the tutorial, and I'm giving you some of my contact information there if you want to reach out to me later. But we have time for questions, about 15 minutes. And we can ask and we can talk in Spanish, or if you want to ask in Portuguese, Soraya can help translate, or I might be able to understand it too. Okay, so we open it up for questions and or comments. Oh, and I see from Sane that we have the proceedings of the conference are out in the ACM Digital Library, so that's good. There was a lot of work getting those out between Soraya in particular, worked really hard to get those there, so I'm glad. Okay, question from Reinaldo. What do you recommend to do when you have a mental block or when you feel you're not making enough progress? So I'm guessing this is with writing, right? So I would say a number of things come to mind when you're writing and you're stuck. So maybe there's another section of the paper you can work on where you could write more easily. And then you can just maybe write some notes about what you wanted to write in the place where you're stuck, and then move on to another part of the paper where maybe you don't have a block and you can just write about it. So you make good use of your time. That's one recommendation. Another one is find someone to talk to and try to explain to them what you're trying to convey, what you're trying to explain in that section of the paper. And maybe that conversation might give you an idea of how to write it and how to explain it to others. And a final idea would be to again go back to similar papers and find out how other people did it, and maybe you can get some inspiration from that.
Felipe, puede activar su audio.
Hola, muchas gracias Juan Pablo, muchas gracias Soraya y a todo el equipo que está detrás. Tengo una pregunta. Mira, resulta que nosotros como académicos de Ingeniería Civil en Informática ya tenemos siempre la duda o el problema al momento de plantear una hipótesis. Pero en memorias de pregrado que consisten en desarrollos de software, ¿ya? Porque claro, en una investigación, claro, hay objetivos, ¿cierto? Hay una hipótesis, algo que rechazar o aceptar, pero en un desarrollo de software generalmente es un sistema que se crea. Entonces, ¿cómo podemos hacer para plantear una hipótesis para un desarrollo de software? Pero me di a entender, ¿no?
Sí, sí, claro. En ese caso, como no se está realizando un experimento, no habría una hipótesis. Y lo que habrían en vez serían objetivos de la investigación. O sea, igual, si tú desarrollas un sistema o no sé, un software library o algo así, ¿no? vas a tener un objetivo, de cualquier manera, un objetivo de investigación, y quizás en una sección de métodos puedes hablar, puedes contar cuál fue el proceso que llevó a la arquitectura con la que terminaste, por ejemplo.
Perfecto.
¿Cuál fue el proceso de llevar a eso? Y luego, claro, es un poquito diferente porque no tienes tantos resultados, o sea, presentas cómo quedó tu sistema,
Claro.
y quizás lo usaste o presentas algunos ejemplos de cómo se puede usar. O sea, es un poquito diferente. Y ahí la conferencia de Human Computer Interaction que trata de sistemas mucho es la WIST, que voy a poner, es UIST, que esa es la conferencia de sistemas, o sea, todos los que
Ujú.
trabajan en más del lado de ingeniería de software, y
¿Ya?
publican en Human Computer Interaction, publican ahí. Entonces, eso puede dar una idea, justamente como estaba hablando más temprano, de cómo estructuramos nuestros artículos y eso. Eh, los artículos de WIS pueden dar una buena pauta de cómo la gente que trabaja en sistemas está publicando esos artículos en, en- en buenas conferencias. WIS es bastante difícil de entrar ahí, es muy competitivo, muy selectivo, pero puede dar buenas ideas eh, de cómo estructurar un artículo.
Juan Pablo, muchas gracias, te
Ok,
pasaste.
Tenemos otra pregunta de Catherine. Adelante, Catherine.
Hola, ¿se escucha bien?
sí.
Gracias. Bueno, soy de Chile y quería hacer dos consultas. La primera es que yo soy estudiante todavía, entonces, bueno, esta información me sirve como para mi futuro como profesional, pero hace muy poco tiempo comencé como a leer muchos más papers y empezar como a desarrollar la práctica de leerlos en general, y quería saber si es que podría dar algún consejo como para personas como yo que están recién partiendo como a leerlo, porque por ejemplo en un momento mencionó de que era malo como repetir información
Ujú.
mientras uno escribía.
Sí.
Y muchos de los que he leído repiten mucha información y yo como nueva, sí como que me pierdo porque empiezan a hablar de una cosa y después como que vuelven a repetirlo muchas veces y ahí es como que complica un poco el entendimiento, digamos, de lo que uno quiere saber. Entonces, quería saber si tenía algún consejo como para las personas novatas en esto porque también me ha tocado escribir y también quiero no caer en lo mismo. Entonces, no sé, algún consejo.
Sí, o sea, en general, el proceso que yo veo que funciona un poquito más, de manera más fácil, es el primer paso quizá es poder aprender a leer bien los artículos, como tú estabas diciendo. Y hay estos conceptos que había mencionado antes, cuando nosotros tenemos clubes de lectura aquí en mi universidad, por ejemplo, y ahí leemos un paper, vamos punto por punto de todos estos conceptos y los discutimos. Y eso es algo que te puede ayudar. Si pudieras, por ejemplo, si hay otra gente que está interesada en Human Computer Interaction en tu universidad, eh, armar un grupo de lectura que todas las semanas se puedan juntar y leer un artículo y discutirlo, sirve bastante. Porque es una cosa de hacerlo por uno mismo y pensar, quizás tener una conversación con uno mismo en la cabeza, que poder hablarlo con otra persona que también lo leyó, ¿no? Que tiene intereses similares. O sea que eso puede ayudar bastante. Y muchas veces justamente un primer paso para empezar a escribir mejor es poder ser un poco más crítico con la lectura que hacemos de otros artículos. Entonces ahí uno se empieza a dar cuenta con los mejores artículos, ¿no? Por qué bien que está este artículo, que le va bien en todos estos conceptos. Entonces ahí puedes empezar a pensar, ¿y cómo es que lo hacen? ¿Cómo hacen para convencerme de que es importante el trabajo, de que usaron los mejores métodos, de que tienen buena cobertura de todo el trabajo relacionado? y así de a poco vamos aprendiendo a escribir. Y quizá la más fácil de hacer es, cuando uno empieza a escribir, es como hacían en la Edad Media o el Renacimiento, que hacían todos los que Leonardo da Vinci, todos los famosos, Michelangelo, iban de aprendices primero, ¿no? Con sus maestros, y imitaban, y después con un tiempo tenían sus propias creaciones más particulares de ellos, ¿no? Con su propio toque. Y una manera de empezar, que fue como me pasó a mí, que al principio quizá imitas un poquito más artículos que otros han publicado, o sea, en la estructura y en cómo arman el artículo, y quizá con tiempo vas, si te va bien con eso, puedes empezar a tener tu propia manera de hacerlo, ¿no? Que te sientes más confortable, pero quizá empezando por ese lado de ver eh, cómo se hacen, cómo han tenido éxito otros, es una buena manera de empezar. A ver, parece que había una pregunta en el chat.
Muchas gracias.
Oh, ok, de nada. Había una pregunta en el chat de Fabricio, me parece. ¿Qué pasa si ya tienes si estás al final de escribir una tesis? Que sí, que eso lleva mucho tiempo y mucho estrés también. Sí, ahí son tiempos complicados ahora también con la pandemia, no ha ayudado para nada. Y sí, ahí lo único que podría decir es siempre tratar de conversar con otras personas, a ver cómo, para explicarles lo que tú quieres escribir, eso siempre puede ayudar. Em, y bueno, después tratar de en lo posible de mantener una vida saludable en todo el resto, tratar de conversar con otra gente, salir a caminar afuera, cuidarse a uno mismo también, y así eso quizá puede evitar un poco de los otros problemitas también. Ok.
Otra pregunta en el chat de Daisy Ortega. Ella pregunta, ¿cómo puedo aprender a ser más concreta al escribir?
Sí, ahí no es fácil. A veces quizá lo que te puede servir es que salgan tus ideas y tú las dejas que salga todo y las escribes. Y luego tratas de releerlas y decir, bueno, ¿cómo puedo eh, decir lo mismo con menos espacio y con menos palabras de una manera más eficiente? Y eso creo que es lo mejor, que a veces cuando yo empezaba a escribir, a veces pensaba, uy, llegaré a las 8 páginas o 10 páginas. Y ahora cuando escribo siempre me sobra y tengo que achicar luego, pero la idea justamente con eso es que dejamos que salgan todas nuestras ideas, sin preocuparnos demasiado de cómo salen, y luego al releer tratamos de usar menos espacio y ser eh, más eficiente con nuestras palabras y tratar de usar oraciones más cortas. Eso es algo que ahora estos días he estado leyendo un poquito de los cuentos cortos de Jorge Luis Borges, y él era muy de tratar de ser muy eficiente con su escritura, o sea, tratar de encontrar una palabra, un adjetivo que valiera por 10 palabras a veces. Y tenía mucho cuidado con eso, y bueno, es un arte, ¿no? Pero esa es la idea, o por lo menos lo que me ha funcionado a mí. Ok, aquí pongo de vuelta el slide con mi información de contacto. Pregunto también si la presentación estará disponible en algún lugar. Sane, no sé si, creo que la estamos grabando, ¿no? O sea que...
Sí, en cuanto la tengamos disponible, bueno, vamos a ahí estar publicando no nada más este tutorial, sino también otras presentaciones en el canal de YouTube de CLIHC. En un momento se los pongo aquí en el enlace.
Ok.
Pero igual les enviaremos un correo finalizando el evento con esta información.
Muy bien. Bueno, si se les ocurre alguna pregunta luego, aquí tienen mi correo electrónico y Twitter. Y bueno, otra información, si quieren me pueden llamar por teléfono también, pero ya no se usa tanto, ¿no?
Muchas gracias, Juan Pablo,
Ok.
por aceptar hacer este tutorial.
¿Cómo no?
Y me gustaría proponer una foto con todos los participantes. Si
A ver.
puedes,
Vamos a ver
sí.
si...
¿Quién puede prender la cámara? Por favor, para que tengamos un recuerdo de este momento. ¿Y cómo se dice? Cheese en otras partes. ¿Cómo dicen? Para que sonrían para la cámara en tu país, en tus países.
Sí. En Uruguay decían whisky, aunque no sé si...
Whisky.
Ajá. Whisky creo que
Ese me
es
parece que es
internacional.
muy regional, no sé.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Ok.
Es un gusto que participen al evento. Muchas
Hoy
gracias.
ni nos avisaste de la foto.
¿Ya? Todos están tomando, creo, ¿no? Vamos a compartir después.
Ok.
Estamos platicando en español, pero hay personas de Brasil aquí también, ¿no? Fabricio y Diógenes. Espero que estén entendiendo todo. Julia también.
Muy bien. Bueno.
Listo.
Gracias a todos. Obrigado. Y bueno, nos vemos en media hora. Arrancamos con la próxima sesión de
Sí.
CLIHC.
Gracias.